On this day in history, April 8th, 1250, as part of the Seventh Crusade, the Ayyubids of Egypt captured King Louis IX of France in the Battle of Fariskur. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Seventh Crusade. As the loss of Jerusalem in 1187 produced the Third Crusade, so its loss in 1244 produced the Seventh. As the preaching of the Fifth Crusade had taken place in the Lateran Council of 1215, so that of the Seventh Crusade began in the Council of Lyon of 1245. But the preaching of the Crusade by Innocent IV at Lyon was a curious thing. On the one hand, he repeated the provisions of the Fourth Lateran Council on behalf of the Crusade to the Holy Land. On the other hand, he preached a crusade against Frederick II, and promised to all who would join the full benefits of absolution and remission of sins. While the papacy thus bent its energies to the destruction of the Crusades in their genuine sense, and preferred to use it for its own political objects what was meant for Jerusalem, a layman took up the derelict cause, with all the religious zeal which any pope had ever displayed. Paradoxically enough, it was now the turn for the papacy to exploit the name of crusade for political ends, as the laity had done before, and it was left to the laity to champion the spiritual meaning of the crusade even against the papacy. It was at the end of the year in which Jerusalem had fallen that St. Louis had taken the cross, and by all means in his power he attempted to ensure the success of his projected crusade. He sought to mediate, though with no success, between the Pope and the Emperor. He descended to a whimsical piety, and took his courtiers by guile in distributing to them, at Christmas, clothing on which a cross had been secretly stitched. He started in 1248 with a gallant company, which contained his three brothers and the Sieur de Joinville, his biographer, and after withering in Cyprus, he directed his army in the spring of 1249 against Egypt. The objective was unexpected. It may have been chosen by St. Louis, because he knew how seriously the power of the Sultan was undermined by the Mamluks, who were in the very next year to depose the Ayyubid dynasty, which had reigned since 1171, and to substitute one of their number as Sultan. Damietta was taken without a blow, and the march for Cairo was begun, as it had been begun by the legate Pelagius in 1221. Again, the invading army halted before Mansoura, December 1249. Again, it had to retreat. The retreat became a rout. St. Louis was captured, and a treaty was made by which he had to consent to evacuate Damietta and pay a ransom of 800,000 pieces of gold. Eventually, he was released on surrendering Damietta and paying one half of his ransom, and by the middle of May 1250 he reached Acre, having abandoned the Egyptian expedition. For the next 4 years he stayed in the Holy Land, seeking to do what he could for the establishing of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He was able to do but little. The struggle of papacy and empire paralyzed Europe, and even in France itself there were few ready to answer the calls for help which St. Louis sent home from Acre. The one answer was the Shepherd's Crusade, or Crusade of the Pastoraux, a religious jacquerie, as it had been called by Dean Milman. It had some of the features of the Children's Crusade in 1212. That, too, had begun with a shepherd boy. The leader of the Pastoraux, like the leader of the children, promised to lead his followers dry-shod through the seas, and tradition even said that this leader, Master of Hungary, as he was called, was the Stephen of the Children's Crusade. But the anti-clerical feeling and action of the shepherds was new and ominous, and moved by its enormities, the government suppressed the new movement ruthlessly. None came to the aid of St. Louis, and in 1254, on the death of his mother, Blanche, the regent, he had to return to France.